After an unheralded journey through the Wairarapa from its home in Pahiatua, standard railcar RM31 Tokumaru is parked for the first time in over 35 years at Wellington Railway Station's Platform 8. It's on its way to Fielding, going the long way round as it can't fit through a recently lowered tunnel in the Manawatu Gorge, and has to be towed as it's still to be certified to be driven under its own power. It's taking part in a 3-day festival of steam trains and rail cars, being held to commemorate the centenary of the completion of the North Island Main Trunk Railway. After the standard rail cars were withdrawn from service in 1972, Wellington railway enthusiast John Murphy purchased RM31 along with 2 others, and in August 1973 he ran it up to Auckland. John's interest in railways started when he was still at school, and Alan Smith, one of his schoolmates, well remembers the passion John had in those early days.
I first would have met John back in 1962 when he and I were both in our last year at Hutt Valley High School. But then in 1963 we both started at Victoria University as full-time students, and that's really when I first got to know John. Middle of 1964 the trams finished and the preservation movement really got into gear. And John was one who was in there both in a sort of sleeves rolled up way, pick and shovel and so forth, but also in the drawing and planning layouts and so forth. John was quite a strong-minded individual. He was a big towering fellow and had a manner of someone who was pretty clear in what they wanted, who thought through things and then decided on them. John was always through this period fascinated in a lot of things, one of which of course was the steam traction on the railways. He was a complex fellow who had many different interests, and not all of which melded into each other, but I was aware of his growing interest in standard rail cars. A good friend, and so it was quite a shock was to hear of John's death, quite unexpected. I knew he'd been unwell. In fact, the last time I had seen him he was showing signs of illness, but it was a shock to hear of his death, and it was quite an honour to be at his funeral along with a huge crowd, and especially to hear people talking about John. John was a maverick in some ways. He was a very staunch fellow in other ways. He was a good mate. He was a dedicated sort of person. He was a complex character, and all of us who knew him got a lot to be thankful for, but also in particular the rail movement owes an enormous amount to just the dedication and enthusiasm of commitment of John Murphy.
Standard class railcars weren't the first railcars to run in New Zealand, and the design of them was based on a development process started many years beforehand. Steam locomotives were getting larger, and the costs of running and maintaining them on lightly loaded provincial passenger services couldn't continue to be justified. There were a few attempts at designing and building self-propelled passenger cars, but for a variety of reasons, most of these were not particularly successful. The unreliability of petrol engines and the lack of suitable transmission systems led to many of the early rail cars being abandoned either before or soon after entering service. One of the first reasonably successful railcars was based on the petrol-powered Model T Ford, and 2 were built in 1926 for use mainly in the lower South Island. A replica of one of these has been built by the Pleasant Point Railway and can now be seen running regularly on their short and isolated track. It wasn't until the mid-1930s that the availability of diesel engines and improved transmissions led to the reliability of railcars reaching the stage where 2 were successfully deployed on the Christchurch to Greymouth run in 1936. A few months later, 6 larger rail cars with a bus-like appearance were placed in service between Masterton and Wellington, replacing a slow and noisy ride up the steep Rimutaka incline in a carriage train hauled by the antiquated Fell engines. The introduction of comfortable rail cars brought a welcome relief, and owing to their increased speed, they became affectionately known as the Tin Hares. 2 years later, another 6 rail cars of a planned standard design were built in the Hutt Railway workshops and were initially put into use on the Napier to Gisborne and Wellington to New Plymouth routes. 2 of these rail cars were eventually acquired by the Silverstream Railway Society in Wellington and can be seen here running at their temporary storage site at Seaview in the Hutt Valley in the late 1970s. The need eventually arose to replace the 2 small rail cars on the South Island's West Coast route, and owing to difficulties due to the war effort, an order was placed in England for 10 rail cars to be built by the Vulcan foundry. Delivery was completed in 1940, however one didn't make it to New Zealand because the ship carrying it was sunk in the North Atlantic by a German submarine. Four of these rail cars have been preserved, and here, in June 2003, RM50 is making a photo run on the Plains Railway at Tynwald, just south of Ashburn. In 1955, another class of rail cars ordered from the Drury Car Company in England arrived in New Zealand and was put into service throughout the country. These rail cars were of an articulated design and were powered by Fiat engines and colloquially became known as Fiat rail cars. They had a number of early teething problems that were soon overcome. However, the Fiat engines were not designed for railway use and eventually started breaking down, earning the rail cars a reputation for poor reliability. One railcar was slightly modified and painted light blue to run a service from Hamilton to Auckland, but wasn't very successful, so was then tried on a Wellington to Auckland daylight service. This proved popular, and another 2 cars were similarly modified, with the service becoming known as the Blue Streak, and they ran until they replaced the standard rail cars on the New Plymouth route in 1972. By 1978, the twin-set rail cars had become so unreliable that the decision was made to withdraw all of them from service. The last rail cars to enter service were 3 Japanese-built Silver Ferns that brought air-conditioned comfort to railway travel. They were initially used on a daylight service between Wellington and Auckland, replacing the Blue Streak. In an ironic twist, RM31 is caught at Taihape on its delivery trip to Auckland, parked behind one of the Silver Ferns that were responsible for the standard class's retirement. The Silver Fern railcars have been well received, with lots of charters to all parts of the country, and RM3 is seen in unfamiliar territory during a rail enthusiast's trip on the Wairarapa line. They were replaced on the Wellington to Auckland service in 1991 by a carriage train, and were used for a time on services from Auckland to both Rotorua and Tauranga. After these services were cancelled, the Silver Ferns were used in a suburban role, transporting commuters between Pukekohe and Auckland. They are the only rail cars still in use, and the longest-serving classic rail car ever used in New Zealand. Following a refurbishment program, they should continue well into the future. At the time the twin-set rail cars were withdrawn, travelling by train was still a popular way of getting about in the country, and an alternative had to be found. The railways had begun disposing of many of their older carriages, and owing to the resulting shortage, some of the twin-set rail cars had their motors removed and were painted in a lime green colour, earning them the nickname of grass grubs. They were used in both the North and South Islands on secondary routes until 1985, when passenger rail services to most provincial cities were replaced by buses. One service they were regularly seen on was the very scenic route between Napier and Gisborne, and before its demise they were captured on these 8mm film clips during a rail enthusiast's trip. Passengers' memories of travelling on rail cars, whether for commuting or for taking vacations, are largely favourable, and Graham Gordon fondly remembers as a youngster riding in the Waitarapa rail cars from Masterton to Wellington.
Used to catch the rail car at Masterton and travel to Wellington for holiday periods, and also weekends. Sometimes you go down at 8 o'clock on a Friday and come back later on Sunday. Stop at Featherstone, and then we carry on to Cross Creek, and then at Cross Creek we would be marshalled onto the creek rail, and the guard would get out, walk along the side, engage the lever for the lower gear to climb the Rimatakas. They used to get along quite fast, anything up to 60 miles an hour with a slight sway, especially if you're sitting in the back. The preferential seats were from the middle to the front. Masterton to Wellington would take, from memory, I think it was about 2.5 hours, where the fell engines would take a lot longer, the trains.
Railcars served a valuable transport role during their era, quicker than carriage trains, and took different, less tortuous and often more scenic routes from cars and buses.
I remember that when you hopped on the railcar and you sat in the seats, the floor was quite close to the ground. So you got the impression of speed when you're travelling along, and also when I did travel on them, it was more or less in the late, so just before they finished in about 1972, was in the last year or so. I did enjoy travelling on it and did certainly spur an interest in railways along the way, saw different trains. It was quite interesting. When I got to Wellington on the Standard, then caught the 356 rail car from Wellington to Carterton, and that was a twin-set rail car, and that one always had 2 rail cars coupled on it. And then I also did trips on Blue Street rail cars, and then I also did trips Stratford to Tamaranui, and I also did a trip to Gisborne as well, from Napier to Gisborne. I found rail cars interesting to travel. You could move around, whereas in a bus you are sitting all the way, not able to move around, and the scenery was different because you could look at things that you didn't normally see from the road.
Bruce's comments are exemplified as a twin-set rail car weaves along the tracks south of Gisborne on one of the most attractive railway routes in New Zealand. From high above the sea at Beach Loop, passing in and out of tunnels through bush-covered and steep hill country and crossing over high, spindly viaducts, they wend their way to Napier. These early film clips echo the days before flying became commonplace, when life was more leisurely and there was time to take in the grandeur of the countryside. Today, landscape like this is only seen from thousands of feet above. One person who affectionately remembers travelling on rail cars between her home in Nainai and her job at Masterton Hospital as a student nurse was Marion Spears.
The best time to have gone, of course, was that first rail car. It must have left Masterton at 6 in the morning, and I'm sure it was a commuter's train then. We used to have to arrange to get off at 6:15 to get down to the station. Bob Bakey, a little cube of a man, was the ambulance driver, although he had other guys with him, in a very, very old Ford ambulance that wasn't used in service. It was really a kind of a delivery thing. We'd chat him up to say that, you know, I'm catching the early rail car. So he'd be out the front gate kind of thing, or the front door by at least 10 to 6 and rattle back and down to the station. And I remember saying to the guard, you know, do you stop at Nainai stations, which was easier for me, you know, otherwise it would have been Taita or Waterloo. He said no, but then he came back and said, yes, we'll drop you. Well, going into Wellington would be at the southern end of the station because it's not a regular stop. And I said, well, can I catch the rail car this way when I go back? And he said, when are you going back? And sometimes I'd only spend an overnighter at home because we had to be back, because we were only allowed one day off a week. And he said, well, if you get to the northern end of the station, and if the same driver's on, he'll probably recognise you. I mean, you wouldn't get that today. And it was great, yeah, it was great. But there were such luxury old ladies to travel in. The lovely leather seats and the smooth ride. It was just lovely sitting in this lovely rail car and watching the scenery. I just love it.
Making sure all the passengers arrived safely at their destination was the job of a two-man crew, a guard and the driver. The guard's job was to look after the passengers, but it was the man up front who had the ultimate responsibility, and this was always a job for senior drivers. They all had to work their way up through positions as firemen and drivers on steam engines, and starting at Palmerston North in 1938 was Pat Hickton, who before driving twin-set rail cars worked on a number of different types of steam engine.
BBs, ABs, A's, AA's, K's, KA's, J's. The ABs, they were very, very good. Some of them were excellent. And I sat for my ticket in 46. I went driving in 1948, and then I went back firing. I never got appointed to a first-class engine driver until 1956, even though I sat for my ticket in 53. When you get down there, you do the shunts, and then you go out as your seniority works that way. You go on to what they call the goods roster, and then you go on to the express roster. I started on the rail cars in 1970. We used to go from here to Woodville on 803 right to Wellington, and then we'd change over and come back on 6:30, which was a express goods. And when we went down the express goods from Palmerston to Wellington, we'd get off there, then we would come back on 806 the rail car at 1:35 a.m. If he didn't make it off that express goods from off the trunk, then that joker that took 803 down would take 806 back, and you'd get back here about 5:15. They drove well, they were very good. The only thing that was wrong with them was that when one motor packed up and you had a really big load, and even to cut one motor out on the other was quite simple. Just went down the back there and lifted up the cat and put that dog in the centre, and that cut that motor out.
Driving twin-set rail cars could be full of excitement, and one day Pat had such an experience, as he explains.
We had about 105, 108 people on it. But it was running beautiful. And then we got the Hukanui Bridge and we went over that, and we got 3 parts away at the top. Someone says smoke in the compartment, and I said, I was just going to put the brakes on. Someone pulled the emergency cord, and all the smoke was coming from the vestibule. And within 20-25 minutes, you know, that whole rail car was bloody near burnt out. But they were a good car, but there's only one thing with them. With a lot of the Fiat engines, there's nothing wrong with them except the maintenance. Some of their fitters from Wellington were very good.
I started and finished my apprenticeship at the Hutt Railway Workshops down in Woburn. I started there on the 21st of January 1964. I actually started in the railcar shop. We had the twin sets there, of course, and the standard rail cars. The standard rail cars were built in this shop here back in 1938, 39 era, and it was mainly done on this line here, through this here. It's mainly used as a storage area now for Kiwi Rail. The shell of its former self brings back a lot of memories, this place. There are twin overhead cranes, only one left now. Yeah, we use that for lifting the rail cars off the bogies and onto stands. My first job was to die nut all the studs on the standard rail car bogies. There were 2 bogies per standard rail car, and also tapping out all the threads. Yeah, they were interesting times.
Dave Bohr, a member of the Pahiatua Railcar Society, is captivated by the sheer size of the railway workshops as he's guided around.
Yeah, this here is just basically sub-assembly work. This locomotive here started its life off as a DA. The series 1, 2 and 3 came out, say, from the mid-50s through to the 60s. When I was a young apprentice, I was working on steam locomotives here back in 64. It was really the tail end of the steam era. This carriage was built in the late 30s, early 40s. Now this is a YD wagon, YD number 150. It's for transporting ballast and dumping ballast out on the track. That's another one there. This is a carriage from Glenbrook in Auckland. So a lot of these carriages had wooden framing through here. I have seen the repairs being done in steel. This is the old type lino they've got in here, the old railway lino. Lasts forever.
Selwyn Roberts has spent a large portion of his working life at the workshops and still overhauls small components, much as he did when he started working on rail cars in 1964.
There were different servicing, of course, during the life of it that was done in the railcar depots, but full overhauls, they were taken into the shops. The body would have repairs done as required, but all the inside would be stripped right out. The seats would come out, everything would go. The various structure, as far as they could tell, was inspected, and any repairs, smash repairs or whatever that was done at the time, and all the inside was refitted out. New lino, seats recovered as required, and all the fittings and so on and so forth. The bogies would be completely stripped right out. We would send any components of the bogies as required, would be sent off into other parts of the workshop. Same with the components on the rail car, they would send off into different departments. They would be repaired and then sent back to the group, and then we'd reassemble it all back together again. A lot of the bogie work was done actually within the bogie group itself, but things like final drives that were sent off to another section. The engines, they were done at the Wellington depot, also done up at Otahuhu, and also down in Christchurch. I tended to work more on the twin sets anyway, because there were more of them. A lot of it was visual inspection. Sometimes it would be engine change out, compressor, auxiliary drives, universals, shafts, whatever had to be done, we did it. Later on, I asked if I could go into the engine rebuilding side of it for the Fiat engines. That was granted, and I moved in there about 1969, early 69.
The late Colin Perfect, not long before his untimely death, was filmed while he was interviewing John Bradshaw as part of the process he was undertaking for an in-depth study into twin-set railcars.
Well, this is an interview today with John Bradshaw, who is a previous person who worked with Richardson McCabe Limited, who were the agents for the Drury Car Company in the purchase and delivery of the Drury railcars.
Well, the first thing that cropped up was that they were getting too hot. And so they hired a setup from DSI with the operators, and they recorded the temperatures, all the temperatures they could think of that needed to be recorded to reveal, especially around the radiators, why they were getting hot. The theory, it wasn't clear whether there was lack of heat transfer between the cooling water and the radiators, or between the radiators and the air. And then they thought that perhaps they were getting funny results because they were testing out of Gracefield, just up and down the Hutt Valley, and there were fairly intense crosswinds there, and because of the crosswinds it was difficult to make sense of anything. So they decided to do the testing in the brand new Featherston Tunnel, which they had to get scheduled into, and it was quite an effort, and they still couldn't make sense of the temperatures they were getting. The rail cars would suddenly get hot for reasons that cross-examination of the drivers, the reason wasn't clear. But they went on putting up with that until they got the South Island cars going. And so they thought they'd do more testing in the Otera Tunnel, where they had a good grade to work on, and no crosswinds. Everybody was pretty convinced by then it was something to do with the radiators. We went out into Otera and turned around and headed up the grade. We'd done that on a trip and we'd got nowhere, and so some weeks later we did another trip, and on the way up, before they got to the top of the tunnel, she was boiling good. So we set off again, not quite sure what the hell to do. I remember about Springfield going to Watson and saying, there's a gap between the rail and the bottom of the radiator. Couldn't the air be just going around in a loop like that and getting hotter and hotter and hotter all the time? And it took a bit of sort of persistence on my part to get him to see what I was driving at. But in the end, suddenly he and the other guys on board said, yeah, well, that could be right. So he called up Otera and said, we want to have sheets of corrugated iron and wire and necessary materials to block off the gap. And so everybody got in the pit and started fixing bits of tin as fast as they could, because there were gaps in the timetable when you could go, and otherwise when you couldn't. And so we were rushing for a particular gap and managed to get all the bits on in time and headed up. And the rail car didn't show any increase in temperature at all. It came out full throttle cold.
They were originally designed as a marine engine for Italian motorboats, but as for rail, they weren't really robust enough to withstand the rigours of the rail environment. Crankcases weren't strong enough, and they were actually breaking. The conrods would let go, as the term in the trade, put a leg out of bed. And I remember looking at one engine sitting out on the stand. It had been changed out, and 3/4 of it had been cut through. It was just incredible. We would scavenge any parts off them, what we could, what was any good, and the rest of it was just scrap. We would scavenge around, we would squirrel stock, we would put parts aside. There was new components we could get out of the store as well. I can honestly say, if it wasn't for the mechanical and electrical fitters, just sheer determination to keep these things going. Sure, it was keeping our jobs going as well. You know, we owe a lot to them. The government were determined to get rid of these rail cars, and what our group's doing is rewriting the history books, and we will have a twin set running again.
The whole thing started back in 1990 when New Zealand celebrated its 150th anniversary, and I was served on a local committee. At the end of that year, we had a wind-up meeting at our chairman's house, and during the course of the evening, Warwick Greaves, who was a good friend of mine, and I just came along, and I happened to say to him, "Well, Warwick, that was a busy year. What are we going to do next year?" And I don't know why he said it, but he said, "I wouldn't mind restoring a rail car." And I explained it to him that there were these wire-upper rail cars that used to run over the Rimatukas. There were one or possibly two of them at the Silverstream Railway. And so I started talking to Silverstream Railway, which wasn't so difficult because I was already a member. I said to them, "Well, look, I can't really come down there and work, but I could get a team together here in Paeroa and restore the wire-upper car, which doesn't seem to be having much happening to it. What do you think?" And eventually they came back to me and said, "Yeah, well, put a proposition to us." They wanted us to be able to provide a good, secure shed for it. And I said, "Well, I've thought about that a bit, and the good shed in Paeroa is now derelict. The station was no longer manned and trains had stopped running." And so the railcar arrived August 1992, and we put it in the good shed, and there we were. We had a railcar. We were offered a 40-year lease on it. We decided we'd have to have a structured sort of an organisation. We decided on an incorporated society, which was initially called the Paeroa Railcar Restoration Society Incorporated. The lack of a proper workshop was a bugbear, but the project was underway.
Prior to my involvement, a previous group had started, but were unable to continue because of lack of facilities. At that point they had stripped the old body except for the front and the back and put in a few of the main ribs in the body. We've substituted square hollow steel for the main ribs, mainly for strength and ease of construction as compared to the timber steel composite that was originally built. My ambition is for it to be absolutely as original looking as I can possibly get it. The trouble is that you look at different photographs and you see different interiors and different details. Even the plans say different things on different plans. So I just got to take a midline somewhere, and I'm going by what's on the original plans. Windows are a real big problem. I've had new window frames made. Half the windows are fixed pane, so they're all right, they're good. But the other half are opening windows, and that's still a problem that I've to overcome. We have enough seat frames for half the railcar, so I'll have to make the other half. And then upholstery, which is going to be a really big ticket item. That's hugely expensive. The only other two modifications that we're making is I'm installing an overrider at the back of the railcar to help in the event of a rear end collision. And at the front of the railcar there's an extra cow catcher going in underneath the original existing cow catcher. To just beef that end up a wee bit in case we hit something on the track.
Well, while I was involved in organising the Paeroa Railcar Society and getting the lease and everything, a number of, I guess, well-meaning people started to say to me, "You know, there is another railcar around," and they're talking about RM31, a standard car. It's living in a shed just north of Marston, which I knew about, and I'd heard of John Murphy but never met him. In January 1993, I was home one Sunday morning and my phone went about 7 o'clock, and it was Alan Brabender, the well-known locomotive engineer who lives in Woodville, and he said to me, "Well, I met John Murphy. He offered me the chance to come down and have a look at RM31, and he said he's going to be there today, and I arranged with him last night to be there, and he said, I can't get hold of him and I've been called out." He said, "You couldn't go down, could you, for me?" I said, "Yeah, well, I suppose I could." So climbed in the car and went off with some trepidation, I might add, because I'd never met John Murphy. I thought, well, I'm going to be turned up out of the blue. Anyway, I went down there, parked outside the gate, walked down the paddock to the shed, and John's standing in the doorway and said, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, look, I've heard of you. Yeah, well, if you're here, how about we sit down and have a bit of a talk? Then we sat down in RM31, and John and I started to get to know each other. He said, "I've tried to do it all on my own, which has been all right up till now, but he said, I've now realised it's too big for me. I need a group, and, well, if you're interested, maybe we could talk about ways and means of your group getting involved with 31. I said, "Yeah, well, what have you got in mind exactly?" He said, "Well, I've thought about it, and I'd be willing to lease it to you for a peppercorn rental, in return for which," he said,
also give you all the parts. So I've got a huge stack of parts here, which I can see, manuals and the like. He said, just one thing, I'd like to become a member and be involved in it. I thought, well, that's not much of a problem. So I said, well, yeah, my initial reaction is pretty good, but I'll have to run it past the committee, and I can't promise it's going to find favour with all of them because some of them are concentrating on RM5. Anyway, the committee agreed to take on a 30-year lease, I think it was in that case, and so that was eventually signed in front of the rail car with John. But the big problem was we had nowhere to put it, and so we then went into a phase where the rail car stayed shed at Opaki, but the facilities were practically nil. There was no pit. In the meantime, we went through a period where we needed somewhere to put it, and we had to build a railcar depot, which all took about 5 or 6 years. But in the meantime, we had RM31 in Masterton, because by that time it had been moved out of the shed at Opaki into the old railcar depot in Masterton, and quite a lot of work was done on it. And eventually, once we got the shed up, in June 2001, we got permission and it was towed to Paiatua and found its way to the railcar shed. I think John's goals were very clear right from the first time I met him. John's a bloke who, whenever he did something, he really got into it and really did it well. And that goes for many things. He had many other interests, but over time he became very focused on standard rail cars. He was very taken with them. He collected a hang of a lot of information, talked to a lot of old drivers and fitters and all sorts. And then when they were withdrawn from service in 1972, he managed to buy 3 of them, plus a big swag of parts. John really had a dream of a standard railcar back on the main line, and it became the driving force in his life from that point onwards, which was the early 1970s, I think. And by the time I met him, he was starting to worry that he might never achieve it, so that is why he threw in his lot with us.
Drury articulated twin-sets are a class of railcar that was synonymous with rail travel around New Zealand for over 2 decades, up until the late 1970s. Although it was long considered that there was little likelihood of any of these ever being preserved, 2 complete sets did survive, and both have now been added to the Pāhiatua Railcar Society's fleet. A group has begun restoring one of them, and Lee Hall is one of the leaders.
My father worked for the railways as a track worker and a ganger. So we always lived next to the railway and lived most of my life in Hawke's Bay. So I did quite a bit of travelling on the twin sets and Fiats as we called them. So I was very fond of them, I am very fond of them. So I spent a lot of time travelling from Hastings to Wellington. So that was one of the driving forces for me to actually help in the preservation of one. My first contact with RM133 came through Spud Langley from Hastings. He knew Don Selby and was aware of Don's little campaign to save 133 from the airport. And just after a bit of prompting from Spud, we eventually got in touch with Don and things just mushroomed from there. Before that actually happened, I got introduced to Doug Johnson.
The steam train era in the North Island ended around 1967, and that's when I was born, so I wasn't privileged to have seen any of those things in operation, so it was the rail car that continued on the local lines to me for another 10 years. And many services of Drury twin set rail cars that came through, and this would be the early 70s, probably as early as I can remember, being a little fella. And the image and sleek appearance of these streamlined rail cars got my interests from a very early age. I used to pedal my bike down to Upper Hutt as well and see them pull in and watch them load the luggage and people. One day I went into a bookstore and decided, well, it's about time I picked up a Rails magazine and started having to flick through that, you see, just to see what was happening in the general scene. And of course on the back page there was this lovely picture of RM101 in 1955 about saving a twin set rail car, the very last twin set rail car, and of course that, having known that, or knowing up to that point that there were no survivors, this was big news for me. Grabbed my attention straight away and just had to find out more about it. Got involved with the trust from right at the early stages. Contacted the trustees even before the railcar got here. Got involved in the fundraising process.
we decided to put together, or Doug's prompting, to put together a grant application for raising money to shift the railcar. Unfortunately, a matter of days before we were due to visit the railcar to inspect it, we heard that it had been burnt out by a fire, lit during a training session by the fire crew there. One end, the number 2 end, was severely damaged. We left the airport that day rather depressed, but looking back at it, I was still very keen to not let that railcar go, as it was the only remaining railcar that we knew of, apart from the one half of 121, which was at Waitomo.
Went with the guys to Auckland to help with preparations for moving it, and that was September 2001. Saw it here offloaded in February 2002, I think it was, and basically from that point we got stuck in, and the initial focus was to strip the car out, get it back to the bare structure.
It had suffered quite severely from its years out and exposed at the airport. It was severe corrosion close to the sea, so we started a process of just completely stripping the body back to the bare shell, taking out all the linings, what was left of them, taking out the aluminium floor, just to get it back to the bare frame.
The working beers are only every 3 weeks, once every 3 weeks at that stage, so it took us the best part of a year, I think a year and a half, to strip the car out and remove corrosion. And we focused particularly on the number 1 end, which was the better end, the end that we deemed the fittest to be restored.
We're quite surprised that the actual main underframe and a reasonable amount of the body frame was actually still in quite sound condition. We were very fortunate for the project that RM133 was on the original bogies. The bogies are critical to the project because obviously without the bogies we wouldn't have a railcar, so they're a lot heavier construction, or seemed basically sound. So that was a driving force really to get the railcar. We had considered at one stage of only recovering the 3 bogies and the number 1 end, but after discussions with some other railway groups, that they suggested that we take the whole thing, because you never know, we might find something of value in the other half, even though it was quite severely damaged.
I've seen photographs of another survivor, which we always thought was RM121. We had been in contact with the owner of the number 1 end of it in Waitomo, and things were looking positive there, although it was a big job and a big ask at that stage to get that one out. But the number 2 end is what we're really after. We felt that we had to find that number 2 end in order to help the project succeed. It ended service in 1978. It finished on the Tamaranui, New Plymouth Tamaranui services. I think it made its own way to Wellington under its own power, actually. It sat around Wellington, suffered a few broken windows and things like that. It was forwarded to the workshops in Westfield or Otahu, and I think it was destined to become an AC class. And 121 became a surplus rail car and sat around on its own, robbed of its components, before an interested private individual from East Tamaki took interest in it, and he persuaded them to sell it to him, which was very rare. I mean, considering they were cutting the class up, as fast as they could, and so that's where it remained for a little while until he on-sold it. It ended up at East Tamaki at a fun park, and from that point, when the fun park closed down, it got sold off into its 2 component halves. We always knew where the number 1 end went, Kaukopakoppa, then Waitomo. The number 2 end just vanished, and actually nobody knew. Following on from my early leads, which kind of went nowhere, we made the assumption the rail car went north, and I had a few local enthusiasts to have a look around for us, and it certainly wasn't in the lower part of the North Auckland region. It was really not until I went on holiday, a family holiday in late 2001, and stayed in the Bay of Islands over the New Year's, where I made contact with a few people, and they hadn't actually know where they'd seen a railcar body. So I'd followed up on that lead and made contact with the owners, and sure, I went around the next day, and that's what it was.
Doug was away on holiday, and he gave me a phone call to say he had found something, and I knew from the tone of his voice that it was something pretty exciting. So, and I knew he was looking for the other end of 121. So it was partly a shock and partly not a shock when he told me, but it was very exciting, because when I saw the photos, it was painted in the original colours and just looked like a rail car.
It still had a little bit of its NZR paint job left, although it was starting to look fairly tired. It was sitting behind this guy's house. It was on a quarry. It had been separated into two sections at that time. That's the only way they could transport it. We sat beside this house on blocks. The cab was certainly shot, but basically still contained bits and pieces of the original stuff inside it. And the car still had its internal linings and toilet compartments, which was a bonus. I mean, the condition of the structure was very sound. Had I not got there at that time, I believe they were looking to put it under a big shed and store parts in it. At that point, we may not have got it. The underneath of the car was very sound, and the idea initially was it was going to replace RM133's number 2 end, seen as the most practical way forward to have a Drury twin-set rail car running on the main line again.
We're busy rebuilding the cab with the number 2 end. The cabs suffered severe corrosion. Just the way the cabs were built, they were prone to leaking around the windows, and typically with all the rail cars that we've seen so far, they've been very heavily corroded around the window, so around the front. So we basically had to rebuild the front structure of the rail car because all the frame was rotted away at floor level. And that's been a very complex process just because of the shape of the rail car with all the curves, etc.
Contacted Barry Wood from Waitomo, Woodland Park, in 2001 initially about the chance of acquiring it. You know, we explained to him that how rare and important the class was to preservation in New Zealand, and I think he understood immediately. Gave us some options, and said he was open to talk about it. But it wasn't really until around 2004, 2005 we approached him again with a serious intent to acquire it. He wanted something, of physical nature, a carriage to replace it with, no loss of business to himself. We're hoping to have that car on site prior to a Railcar Society depot around 2009.
My involvement has been the component work. Once that started coming on stream, I said to the guys, well, I'll leave you to do the structural and the panel work, but my expertise is really in the component work. Whilst the guys are working on the body work, in the background, I've been working on the component work, and I can say now that I've done most of it. The pneumatics, that's all the braking systems, I've pretty well nailed most of the component work there, and also the electrical component work. Both cabs, I've completed all the component work for the cabs. I've done all the air gauges, I've replicated those. So we've had a lot of stuff donated to us from the length and breadth of the country, from all over the place.
It'll take a little while to get it on the main line yet. It's a 10-year job, which you can say we're halfway through. We're really only missing the underfloor drive chain. The original engines were Fiat with a 5-speed epicyclic gearbox, which we're no longer going to use, that sort of older stuff. The Fiat engines have disappeared, the final drives are gone. The old gearboxes are nowhere to be seen, so we'll be looking at a repower with a good high quality Cummins engine with Voith transmission, something we've worked out that'll work well under the car. We feel, and like others feel, that the restoration of a Drury twin-set railcar, and possibly the only one of its class now that will ever run on the main line, is a very, very important part of the New Zealand railway preservation scene. They played a major role for over 20 years serving the general public on provincial lines in New Zealand, and generally did the job very, very well. Despite some mechanical failings, they generally delivered people safely.
Ever since the beginnings of the New Zealand railway system in the early 1860s, trains have provided a very safe and reliable means of travel. The large collection of rail fans, members of the public who gathered at Fielding during the Labour weekend of 2008 bear real testimony to this. For the visitors who turned up to the event each day, rides up and down Fielding's railway yard in a veteran railcar added to the excitement. For the young, a chance to experience their first ride in a railcar, and for the older, a nostalgic opportunity to reminisce. Steam engines from as far afield as Auckland and Wellington, along with 2 local ones from Fielding, were used to haul numerous excursions about the surrounding countryside throughout the 3 days of the festival. The assembly of such a large number of steam locomotives and rail cars, and the considerable involvement of the government-owned On-Track and Kiwi Rail, signify the importance this historic event has been assigned in the annals of yesteryear. The ceremony, marking the completion of the North Island Main Trunk Railway 100 years ago, was an auspicious occasion in our country's short history, and this festival, celebrating that historic event, was certainly the equal of it. Early on Sunday morning, the sound of bagpipes echoed around the Fielding station platform as passengers and onlookers started arriving for the Silver Fern railcar's half-day trip to Wanganui. A massive effort in the afternoon saw every available locomotive and railcar shuttled up to the north of the town, ready to take part in a cavalcade of railway motive power from a bygone era to the present day. Arranged in order of age, they began rolling slowly down past the station, providing an everlasting memory for the thousands who gathered on the platform and up and down the line.
Absolutely magnificent, and holds a very special place in the history of rail in New Zealand. And when you think the number of locomotives and so many things that part of a heritage were wrecked or destroyed over the years, that this was an era that was very, very special. And for the younger generation to see how life was for the older generation, it's just so exciting. The A.B. Sharon Lee from Mainline Speed. But this is the little darling of Fielding. So this one will get a very special reception in front of the home crowd. Way over the time, but the current, way ahead of its time, but the current owners, Ian Wells, the Mainline Speed, put the streamline nose back on. It's an Art Deco style, but this is the oil burner, not coal-fired. So that looks like a rocket ship. It's just mean, it's magnificent. I don't know why I'm taking these, I've never heard of it. So this is the grey foldable leather. So this is KA942. So in the name of Nigel Bruce. How are you?
And so, finally, after many years of effort, and only after a decision to allow it was made the night before, RM31 was back running under its own power on the main line, albeit for such a short time at a very slow speed, proudly taking its place towards the rear of the cavalcade. It is perhaps a fitting tribute to John Murphy that at the time his dream was ultimately fulfilled, it was before such a large and expectant crowd. Having worked so hard over the years and months leading up to this event, it was a momentous occasion for the Pahiatua Railcar Society as the new owners of RM31. Don Selby, as president, sums it all up.
I think it made us all pretty proud. We all sort of felt that John Murphy was probably with us that day. I'm sure he would have been smiling. I can only say that that was an immense satisfaction to us. John, we've had it out on the main line as we said we would. We're still working forward to get her out there commercially. When it does, I know that you'll be there with us and enjoy it every time it goes out.